Jake Martinez wiped sweat from his face as he looked across the fields of New Eden. The red sun was setting behind the mountains, and the crops needed water before morning. He had been working since dawn fixing the irrigation system that kept breaking down every few weeks. The old pipes were not made for this planet's harsh weather, but they were all his family could afford. His younger sister Maya called from the house that dinner was ready. Jake picked up his tools and walked toward the small building they called home. The Martinez family had lived on New Eden for 3 generations. They grew special crops that could survive in the rocky soil and thin air. It was hard work, but it was honest work. That night changed everything. Jake was eating his mother's stew when bright lights filled the sky. At first, he thought it was another supply ship from Earth bringing seeds and equipment. But this light was different. It was bigger and stranger than anything he had seen before. The whole family ran outside to watch. A massive ship was floating above their valley. It was silver and smooth with no visible engines or windows. The ship was so large it blocked out the stars. Other families from nearby farms came out to stare at the impossible sight. Jake felt excited rather than afraid. He had always wondered what was out there beyond the human colonies. His teachers said there were other species in the galaxy, but humans had never met them. Some people believed the aliens were myths. Others said they were real, but wanted nothing to do with primitive humans. The ship landed in the field next to their farm. The ground shook, but the landing was surprisingly gentle. A door opened with a soft hiss, and a woman in a blue uniform walked out. She looked human, but her uniform had strange symbols that seemed to glow in the dark. The woman walked directly to Jake's house. She knocked on the door politely and waited. Jake's father opened the door with caution. The woman smiled and spoke in perfect English with a slight accent Jake could not place. She introduced herself as Captain Lisa Brooks from the Human Colonial Defense Force. She explained that she was not from any human colony they knew about. She represented humans who had been living among the stars for much longer than anyone on New Eden realized. More importantly, she brought a message from something called the Galactic Coalition. Captain Brooks asked to speak with the family privately. She sat at their kitchen table and told them an incredible story. The galaxy was full of intelligent species who had formed a government called the Coalition. These aliens had been watching humanity for centuries but considered them too young and primitive to make contact. That had just changed. For the first time in 300 years, the Coalition was opening something called the Elite Trial to a new species. One human would be chosen to represent all of humanity. If they succeeded, humans would be welcomed as equals in galactic civilization. If they failed, humanity would remain isolated for another 1,000 years. Captain Brooks had been sent to find the right person. She had visited Earth and the major colonies, but had not found what she was looking for. The Coalition wanted someone who represented the best of human nature but was not corrupted by politics or pride. Someone who could think differently than the advanced alien species who had tried the trial before. Jake listened to this with growing amazement. His parents asked many questions about the dangers and the chances of success. Captain Brooks was honest about both. The trial was extremely difficult, and most candidates failed completely. Even those who succeeded were often changed forever by the experience. But if humanity was going to have a future among the stars, someone had to try. The next morning, Captain Brooks's small shuttle developed engine trouble. She was stranded until repair parts could be brought from her main ship. Jake offered to help even though he knew nothing about alien technology. He spent hours looking at the damaged engine with Captain Brooks explaining how it worked. The problem was complex, but Jake approached it like any broken machine on the farm. He asked simple questions about what each part was supposed to do. He borrowed tools from his father's workshop and improvised solutions using spare parts from their irrigation system. Most importantly, he was not afraid to try things that might not work. After 6 hours of careful work, the shuttle's engine was running better than before. Captain Brooks stared at Jake with new interest. She asked him more questions about how he had learned to fix machines and solve problems. She seemed surprised by his answers. Jake explained that on a frontier farm, everything broke down eventually. You learned to fix things yourself, or you went without. You used whatever materials you could find, and you never gave up trying. You also learned that every problem had a solution if you were willing to look at it from different angles. That evening, Captain Brooks made an offer that would change Jake's life forever. She asked him to volunteer for the elite trial. She believed his way of thinking was exactly what humanity needed. Jake was not the strongest or smartest human she had met, but he had something more valuable. He could see possibilities that others missed, and he never stopped trying to find answers. Jake's parents were worried about sending their 17-year-old son into space to face unknown dangers. But they also understood that this was bigger than their family or even their planet. If Jake could help secure humanity's future among the stars, then the risk was worth taking. Jake made his decision that night as he looked up at the alien ship floating above his home. He had spent his whole life wondering what was out there beyond the human worlds. Now he had a chance to find out and maybe help his species take its place among the stars. He told Captain Brooks he would go. She smiled and said she had hoped he would say that. Tomorrow they would leave New Eden behind and begin a journey that would take Jake farther from home than any human had gone before. The boy who had spent his life fixing irrigation pipes was about to represent his entire species in a trial that would determine humanity's destiny. The journey to Nexus Station took 3 days in Captain Brooks's ship. Jake spent most of the time staring out the windows at space. He had seen pictures of stars and planets before, but nothing had prepared him for the real thing. Space was bigger and more beautiful than he had ever imagined. Captain Brooks used the travel time to teach Jake about the different alien species he would meet. She showed him pictures and videos, but warned him that seeing them in person would be very different. She also explained what little humans knew about the elite trial. Most of the information was classified by the Coalition, but she shared what she could. The trial consisted of 5 challenges that tested different aspects of what the Coalition called evolutionary superiority: physical excellence, mental ability, technological innovation, strategic thinking, and something called spiritual transcendence. Each challenge was designed by the galaxy's most advanced civilizations to push candidates beyond their normal limits. When they arrived at Nexus Station, Jake's breath caught in his throat. The space station was enormous beyond belief. It looked like a small moon made of metal and crystal with thousands of ships docked around its surface. Lights moved across its hull in patterns that seemed almost alive. Captain Brooks explained that Nexus Station was older than human civilization and served as the Coalition's main government center. They docked at a section reserved for primitive species. Jake felt embarrassed by how simple their ship looked, compared to the alien vessels around them. Some ships seemed to be made of pure energy, while others appeared to grow like living creatures. One ship was so large it had its own weather systems with clouds forming around its hull. A being was waiting for them at the docking bay. Jake tried not to stare, but he had never seen anything like it before. The creature stood over 8 feet, tall with 4 arms and skin that looked like living crystal. Its face had no features Jake could recognize except for glowing blue points where eyes might be. The being introduced itself as Zeth Kalar from the Vorthan Empire. Its voice came from a small device attached to its chest that translated its words into English. Zeth Kalar would be Jake's guide and administrator during the trial. It explained the basic rules in a voice that showed no emotion. Jake would face 5 challenges over the next several days. He would compete against 3 other candidates from different species. The challenges were designed to be fair, but would test each candidate in ways their species had never experienced before. Most candidates failed within the first 2 challenges. Those who succeeded often took months or years to complete all 5. Zeth Kalar led Jake through corridors filled with aliens of every shape and size imaginable. Some walked on 2 legs like humans, while others floated through the air or moved like liquid. Jake saw beings made of metal, energy, gas, and materials he could not identify. All of them stared at him with curiosity. Humans were apparently famous throughout the galaxy as the species that barely managed to reach the stars. They arrived at a large chamber where Jake met his fellow candidates. The first was Quinara from the Etherian Collective. It appeared as a shifting cloud of golden light that sometimes took human-like shape. When it spoke, its voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. Quinara had been preparing for this trial for 50 years and could manipulate matter at the molecular level. The second candidate was Brix from the Corvan War clans. He looked like a giant insect with armor-like skin and 6 limbs that ended in sharp claws. Brix stood over 7 feet tall and moved with the fluid grace of a natural predator. His species had conquered half their galaxy through superior tactics and combat ability. He had been training for this trial since birth. The third candidate was Velthos from the Aquarian Federation. He was humanoid but with pale blue skin and large black eyes that seemed to look right through Jake. Velthos possessed powerful telepathic abilities and could process information from multiple dimensions. At the same time, his species had achieved perfect harmony through shared consciousness. All 3 candidates looked at Jake with expressions ranging from amusement to contempt. They had heard of humans but considered them barely more advanced than primitive animals. Jake was clearly the youngest candidate by decades and came from a species that still fought wars over basic resources. Zeth Kalar announced that the first challenge would begin immediately. They were led to another chamber containing the largest obstacle course Jake had ever seen. The course stretched for miles in all directions and seemed to exist in several dimensions at once. Parts of it were underwater while others appeared to be in open space. Some sections glowed with dangerous radiation while others were covered in ice. The course would adapt to each candidate's weaknesses and test their physical limits. Environmental hazards would change every few minutes to prevent candidates from developing strategies. The goal was simple: reach the end alive and as quickly as possible. Quinara went first. As a being of pure energy, it could phase through most solid obstacles, but struggled with areas designed to disrupt energy patterns. The course generated electromagnetic fields that caused Quinara to flicker and lose cohesion. It had to constantly reform itself while navigating through acid rain and gravity wells. Brix used his natural strength and combat training to power through most challenges. His armor-like skin protected him from extreme temperatures and toxic environments. But the course included puzzles that required delicate manipulation and precise timing. His claws were not designed for fine work, and he struggled with obstacles that required gentle touch. Velthos relied on his telepathic abilities to predict how the course would change and plan his route accordingly. He could sense danger before it appeared and avoid most traps. However, some sections blocked telepathic abilities entirely, and he had to navigate using only his physical senses. Then it was Jake's turn. He stood at the starting line looking at obstacles that seemed impossible for a human to overcome. The first section involved crossing a chasm filled with boiling acid while gravity shifted randomly in all directions. The other candidates had used their special abilities to get across, but Jake had no special powers. Instead of trying to fight his way through, Jake stopped and studied the challenge. He noticed that the gravity shifts followed a pattern, even though they seemed random. The acid bubbled in rhythm with the gravity changes. Jake realized he could use the gravity fields to slingshot himself across the chasm if he timed it correctly. He waited for the right moment, then jumped. The shifting gravity caught him and threw him forward much faster than he could have moved on his own. He landed safely on the other side, while the other candidates were still struggling through the middle of the obstacle. Jake approached each new challenge the same way. Instead of fighting against the course, he looked for ways to work with it. He used the acid rain to dissolve barriers that were blocking his path. He turned radiation fields into energy sources for broken equipment. He converted ice walls into slides that carried him to higher levels. While the other candidates battled against each obstacle, Jake treated the course like a partner in an elaborate dance. He moved through challenges that had taken the others hours to complete. By the time he reached the final section, the other candidates were still struggling through earlier parts of the course. The final obstacle was a maze of laser barriers that moved in complex patterns. The other candidates would eventually use their superior abilities to force their way through. Jake watched the patterns for several minutes, then simply walked through, following a path that appeared and disappeared in perfect timing with his steps. He crossed the finish line in record time. Zethkalar's crystal face showed no emotion, but Jake could sense surprise in the administrator's posture. The other candidates finally completed the course hours later, looking exhausted and frustrated. They stared at Jake with new respect mixed with confusion. How had a primitive human succeeded where advanced alien candidates had struggled? Jake just smiled and said it reminded him of fixing irrigation systems back home. Sometimes the best solution was not to fight the problem, but to understand it and work with it instead. The second challenge took place in a chamber that hurt Jake's eyes to look at. The room seemed to exist in more dimensions than his brain could process. Walls curved in impossible directions, and the floor sometimes became the ceiling without. Warning: in the center of this space floated a puzzle made of pure mathematics and light. Zethkalar explained that this challenge tested mental ability. The puzzle required candidates to think in ways that went beyond their species' normal patterns. It was a multi-dimensional maze where each decision created new realities that had to be calculated at the same time. Most candidates spent weeks trying to solve it. Velthos went first and immediately showed why his species was considered mentally superior. His telepathic mind could hold dozens of solution paths simultaneously. He moved through the early stages of the puzzle with elegant precision. The maze responded to his thoughts by creating new patterns of incredible complexity. Quinara approached the challenge differently. As an energy being, it could directly manipulate the light patterns that made up the puzzle. It reshaped entire sections of the maze and created shortcuts through dimensions that solid beings could not access. The puzzle fought back by generating electromagnetic interference, but Quinara adapted quickly. Brix surprised everyone by applying military tactical analysis to the mathematical problem. He treated each section of the maze like a battlefield and planned his moves several steps ahead. His approach was crude compared to the others, but it was effective. He advanced steadily through challenges that would have stopped most candidates. Then, Jake stepped up to face the puzzle. For hours, he just stood there staring at the shifting patterns of light and mathematics. The other candidates began to whisper that his primitive human brain simply could not handle the complexity. Even Zethkalar seemed concerned that Jake had reached his limit. But Jake was not trying to solve the puzzle the way the others had. Instead, he was asking different questions. Why did this puzzle exist at all? What was its real purpose? Who had built it, and what were they trying to accomplish? He began to see the maze not as an obstacle to overcome, but as a message from its creators. Jake realized that the puzzle was not just testing intelligence, it was testing the ability to understand how alien minds worked. Each section had been designed by a different species and reflected their unique way of thinking. The Vorthan sections valued logical progression, while the Etherian parts emphasized creative transformation. The Corvan areas required strategic planning, and the Aquarian zones demanded emotional balance. Instead of trying to impose human logic on an alien creation, Jake began to think like each species that had contributed to the puzzle's design. He approached Vorthan sections with methodical reasoning and Etherian areas with intuitive leaps. For Corvan challenges, he planned like a general, and for Aquarian parts, he sought harmony and balance. This approach took much longer than simply trying to force his way through. The other candidates completed their attempts and watched as Jake slowly worked his way deeper into the puzzle than anyone had gone before. He was not just solving mathematical problems, but learning to communicate with minds that thought in completely different ways. When Jake finally emerged from the puzzle chamber, he had gained something more valuable than a solution. He had developed the ability to understand alien perspectives without losing his own human viewpoint. Zethkalar noted this achievement with what might have been approval. The third challenge moved them to a massive workshop filled with tools and materials from dozens of different civilizations. Candidates had to create something entirely new, using whatever resources they could find. The challenge tested technological innovation and creative thinking under pressure. Quinara immediately began working with energy manipulation devices. It created a weapon that could reshape matter at the quantum level. The device was elegant and powerful enough to level mountains or build cities with equal ease. The weapon demonstrated the Etherian mastery of fundamental forces. Bricks focused on military applications and built an adaptive armor system. The armor could analyze any threat and instantly reconfigure itself for maximum protection. It incorporated shield generators, weapon systems, and tactical computers into a seamless whole. The armor represented Corvan engineering at its finest. Velthos created a communication device that could bridge any gap between different forms of consciousness. The device could translate not just languages, but entire ways of thinking. It allowed completely alien minds to share ideas as easily as if they were the same species. The communicator embodied Aquarian ideals of universal understanding. Jake spent the first hour just exploring the workshop and learning how the different tools worked. The other candidates were already deep into their projects while he was still figuring out basic operations. Some observers began to doubt whether humans possessed enough technological knowledge to compete. Then Jake began building something that looked surprisingly simple compared to the others' creations. His device appeared to be nothing more than a combination of gears, springs, and basic electronics. It looked primitive next to quantum manipulators and consciousness bridges. Some of the alien observers seemed disappointed by the crude mechanical contraption. But when the testing began, Jake's device proved to be the most versatile of all. Unlike the other's specialized creations, his machine could adapt its function based on what was needed. It could serve as a tool, weapon, communication device, or manufacturing system. More importantly, it was reliable and easy to repair using simple materials. The other candidates had created masterpieces of advanced technology, but Jake had built something that could actually be used by ordinary people in real situations. His device embodied the human approach to engineering. It was not the most sophisticated solution, but it was practical and dependable. Zeth Kalar tested each creation thoroughly and recorded detailed measurements. Jake's device consistently outperformed the others in unexpected ways. It was not the most powerful or elegant, but it was the most useful. The evaluators seemed puzzled by this result, but could not argue with the data. After the testing was complete, the candidates were given time to rest and prepare for the next challenge. Jake found himself thinking about the differences between his approach and that of his competitors. They had each tried to showcase their species' greatest strengths, while he had simply tried to build something that worked. The other candidates were clearly more advanced than humans in almost every way. Their technologies were centuries ahead of anything humans had developed. Their mental abilities far exceeded human limitations. Their physical capabilities made humans look weak and clumsy. But Jake was beginning to understand that advancement was not the same as wisdom. Each species had become so specialized in their particular strengths that they had difficulty thinking outside their established patterns. They approached every problem by applying their greatest abilities, whether those abilities were the best tool for the job or not. Humans were different because they had to be. Without any single overwhelming advantage, they had learned to be adaptable. They used whatever tools were available and found creative solutions to problems that seemed impossible. They survived by being flexible rather than by being the best at any one thing. Jake wondered if this was what the elite trial was really testing. Not which species was the most advanced, but which one could offer something new to the galactic community. The Coalition already had access to incredible technologies and vast mental powers. What they might need was a different way of looking at problems. As he prepared for the fourth challenge, Jake felt more confident than when he had started. He was not trying to prove that humans were better than other species. He was simply showing what humans could contribute to a galaxy that had perhaps become too comfortable with its own limitations. The fourth challenge was unlike anything Jake had experienced before. He found himself standing in a control room overlooking what appeared to be an entire world. Zeth Kalar explained that this was a perfect simulation of a struggling civilization, facing multiple crises. Each candidate would govern identical societies and guide them through disasters that could destroy everything they had built. The simulated world contained millions of digital people who behaved exactly like real populations. They had their own cultures, beliefs, and conflicts that had developed over thousands of years. Resources were running low while natural disasters struck regularly. Internal groups fought over religion and territory while external enemies threatened. Invasion. Each candidate had to find ways to ensure their civilization survived and grew stronger. Brix immediately took control with military precision. He organized the population into efficient hierarchies based on combat ability and strategic value. Resources were distributed according to strict military priorities. Internal conflicts were settled through combat trials, while external threats were met with overwhelming force. His civilization became powerful and disciplined but rigid in its thinking. Within days, Brix had expanded his territory through conquest and established trade routes protected by military force. His people were well-fed and secure, but they lived under strict rules that governed every aspect of their lives. Art and philosophy were discouraged unless they served military purposes. The civilization was strong, but it had lost much of what made it interesting. Quinera took a completely different approach focused on transcendence through technology. It immediately began developing advanced sciences that could solve resource problems and prevent natural disasters. The population was encouraged to abandon physical needs and pursue higher forms of consciousness. Traditional cultures were replaced with unified pursuit of technological advancement. Quinara's civilization achieved incredible breakthroughs in a remarkably short time. They developed energy sources that seemed infinite and technologies that could reshape their entire world. But in pursuing transcendence, they lost touch with the simple pleasures and basic human connections that had once defined their culture. The people became isolated and emotionally distant, even as they gained godlike powers. Velthos applied telepathic principles to create a collective decision-making system. Every major choice was made through mental consensus that took into account the needs and desires of the entire population. Conflicts were resolved through shared understanding rather than force. The civilization achieved remarkable harmony and cooperation between different groups. Under Velthos's guidance, the people learned to work together in ways that seemed almost magical. They anticipated each other's needs and coordinated their actions without the need for complex organizations. Resources were shared fairly and efficiently, while natural disasters were met with unified response. But the civilization struggled when quick, decisive action was needed because every decision required lengthy consensus building. Jake's approach initially appeared chaotic compared to the others. Instead of imposing a single solution from above, he spent time learning what different groups within his civilization actually wanted and needed. Some people valued security while others prized freedom. Some groups focused on tradition, while others embraced change. Some communities were religious, while others were practical. Rather than trying to force everyone to follow the same path, Jake created systems that allowed different communities to thrive in their own ways while maintaining cooperation. He established trade networks that let each group contribute their strengths while receiving what they lacked. Military protection was provided, but not at the cost of individual liberty. Scientific advancement was encouraged, but traditional wisdom was preserved. Jake's civilization looked messy and inefficient compared to the others. Different regions developed in different directions, and there was constant negotiation between competing interests. Some observers questioned whether such a diverse society could survive serious challenges. The other candidates seemed confident that their more unified approaches would prove superior. Then the simulation introduced an unexpected crisis that none of the candidates had prepared for. A philosophical movement arose that questioned the fundamental assumptions each civilization was built on. The movement asked whether progress was always good and whether unity was worth the cost of individual identity. It challenged people to think about what kind of future they really wanted. Brix's military civilization struggled to deal with ideas that could not be defeated through force. His rigid hierarchy was designed to follow orders without question, but this crisis required people to think for themselves. Attempts to suppress the movement only made it stronger and more appealing to those who felt oppressed by constant military discipline. Quinara's technological paradise found its people unprepared for questions about the value of advancement. They had been taught that transcending physical existence was the highest goal, but now some wondered if they had lost something important along the way. The movement grew among those who missed the simple connections and emotions they had given. up in pursuit of higher consciousness. Velthos's harmonious society was torn apart by ideas that could not be resolved through consensus. The telepathic unity that had been their greatest strength became a weakness when people began questioning whether shared consciousness was destroying individual identity. The collective decision-making process broke down when there was no clear majority position. Jake's diverse civilization proved surprisingly resilient in the face of philosophical challenge. Because different communities had been allowed to develop their own values and systems, they could respond to the crisis in different ways. Some groups embraced the new ideas while others rejected them, but they had experience working together despite their differences. The crisis that destroyed the other civilizations became an opportunity for growth in Jake's society. Different communities experimented with various responses to the philosophical questions while sharing their results with others. The civilization became stronger and more adaptive rather than weaker and more divided. When the simulation ended, Jake's civilization was the only one that had not just survived, but actually thrived during the unexpected crisis. The evaluators were clearly surprised by this result, but the data was undeniable. Diversity and flexibility had proven more valuable than unity and strength. The fifth and final challenge was completely different from everything that had come before. Jake found himself alone in a small, empty room with no instructions or equipment. Zethkalar explained that this challenge tested something called spiritual transcendence, but would not say what that meant. Candidates were simply told to discover the answer for themselves. This was where most candidates throughout history had failed completely. Those who emerged from the challenge were often changed so fundamentally that they could barely function in normal society. Others came out completely broken by whatever they had experienced. A few achieved some form of enlightenment, but could never adequately explain what had happened to them. Jake entered the chamber expecting to find some kind of test or puzzle to solve. Instead, he found nothing but four walls and silence. Hours passed without anything happening. He tried talking to the walls, looking for hidden panels, and even meditating like he had seen in movies. Nothing worked. Days went by in the empty room. Jake began to experience strange visions of humanities, past and future. He saw the wars and suffering that had marked human history, but also the moments of beauty and connection that made life worth living. He witnessed possible futures where humans became conquerors of the galaxy, and others where they served as bridges between species that could not understand each other. Jake saw his own species with painful clarity. Humans were violent and irrational, creatures who often acted against their own best interests. They were primitive compared to the other species in the galaxy and would probably remain so for centuries to come. They made terrible mistakes and learned from them slowly, if at all. But Jake also saw the qualities that made humans special despite their flaws. They never stopped trying even when success seemed impossible. They cared about others even when it cost them personally. They found joy in simple things and created beauty in the darkest circumstances. They adapted to any environment and survived disasters that would have destroyed other species. Unlike the other candidates who tried to transcend their species' limitations or prove their superiority, Jake found himself embracing humanity's contradictions. He realized that the challenge was not about becoming something greater than human, but about understanding what being human truly meant. The greatest strength humans possessed was not any particular ability, but their willingness to keep trying. They failed constantly, but they never gave up. They made mistakes, but they learned from them. They suffered, but they still found reasons to hope. They were ordinary in almost every way, but their ordinariness was actually extraordinary. When Jake finally emerged from the chamber, he was fundamentally unchanged, but with a deep understanding of what the trial had been testing. The other candidates had failed because they approached the challenge trying to prove they deserved to lead the galaxy. Jake had succeeded by accepting that humans might not deserve anything, but they would keep trying anyway. Szeth Kalar was waiting, outside the chamber, with what might have been surprise in its alien features. Jake had been inside for only 3 days, while other candidates usually took weeks or months. More importantly, he seemed completely normal rather than transformed by the experience. Jake realized that the elite trial had never been about finding the most advanced species to rule over others. It was about finding a species that could offer something new to a galaxy that had become trapped by its own success. The Coalition had incredible power and knowledge, but they had lost the ability to see beyond their established patterns. What they needed was not another advanced species to join their ranks, but a different perspective that could help them remember what they had forgotten in their pursuit of perfection. They needed someone who could fail gracefully, adapt quickly, and keep trying when others had given up hope. Jake stood in the great assembly hall of Nexus Station, facing hundreds of alien dignitaries from across the galaxy. The Supreme Chancellor, Korth, sat on a throne made of crystallized starlight, while representatives from 12 different species filled the chamber. Captain Brooks and Dr. Grant watched from the human section, looking proud but nervous about what would happen next. The other candidates stood beside Jake, but their expressions showed they knew they had failed. Quinara's golden light flickered weakly, while Brix's claws scraped nervously against the floor. Velthos stared at Jake with telepathic confusion, unable to understand how a primitive human had succeeded where advanced aliens had failed. Szeth Kalar stepped forward to address the assembly. Its crystal form reflected the chamber's lights as it began to speak in the formal language of Coalition proceedings. The trial results were unprecedented in the 300-year history of the Elite Challenge. For the first time, a candidate had completed all 5 tests with what could only be described as ease. More shocking than Jake's success was the manner of his achievement. Previous successful candidates had taken years to complete the trial and emerged fundamentally changed by the experience. They had proven their species' worthiness through demonstrations of superior strength, intelligence, or technological advancement. Jake had done something completely different. The Supreme Chancellor leaned forward with obvious interest as Szeth Kalar continued its report. Jake had not succeeded by proving human superiority in any traditional sense. Instead, he had approached each challenge with a perspective that no previous candidate had demonstrated. He treated obstacles as puzzles to understand rather than enemies to defeat. He looked for cooperation rather than domination. He accepted failure as part of learning rather than something to be avoided at all costs. Commander Nixtel from the Vorthan military stood up to object. His species had created the elite trial to identify civilizations worthy of joining the Coalition's inner circle. The trial was designed to test the fundamental qualities that made a species fit to guide galactic civilization. How could a primitive human who barely understood basic science be considered worthy of such responsibility? Other voices joined the protest. Representatives from the Korvan war clans pointed out that humans still fought wars over basic resources. The Etherian Collective noted that human technology was thousands of years behind Coalition standards. The Aquarian Federation questioned whether a species that could not achieve mental unity could be trusted with galactic security. Jake listened to the arguments with growing understanding of what was really happening. These advanced species had spent centuries competing to prove they deserved to join the coalition elite. They had developed incredible abilities and technologies, but they had also become trapped by their own success. Each species could only see problems through the lens of their particular strengths. When given the chance to speak, Jake surprised everyone by agreeing with his critics. He admitted that humans were primitive, violent, and unpredictable. They made terrible mistakes and often acted against their own best interests. They would probably continue making these same errors for centuries to come. In almost every measurable way, humans were inferior to the species already in the coalition. But Jake pointed out that these same qualities were exactly what had allowed him to succeed where others had failed. Sometimes the galaxy needed species that would make the wrong choice for the right reasons. Sometimes it needed people who would help others, even when it was not logical. Sometimes it needed someone willing to keep trying even when success seemed impossible. The coalition had achieved incredible things through the pursuit of perfection. They had eliminated war, poverty, and disease from most of their worlds. They had developed technologies that seemed like magic and expanded their knowledge to cover almost every aspect of existence. But in becoming perfect, they had also become predictable. Jake suggested that the elite trial had never been about finding another advanced species to join the existing power structure. It was about finding a species that could offer something the coalition had lost in its pursuit of advancement. They needed a fresh perspective that was not bound by assumptions about what advancement meant or what perfection looked like. The chamber erupted in debate as different factions argued about Jake's interpretation of the trial. Some representatives insisted that only the most advanced species could be trusted with galactic leadership. Others wondered if the coalition had indeed become too rigid in its thinking and needed new approaches to unsolved problems. Supreme Chancellor Korth called for silence and addressed Jake directly. The Chancellor wanted to know what humans would bring to the coalition that the existing species could not provide. What unique contribution could justify accepting such a primitive species as equals rather than subjects to be guided and protected? Jake's answer was simple and honest. Humans would bring their humanity. They would ask questions that others had stopped asking. They would try solutions that others had dismissed as impossible. They would care about outcomes that others considered irrelevant. They would fail frequently, but they would never stop trying to do better. More importantly, humans would serve rather than seek to dominate. They understood that leadership meant helping others succeed rather than proving your own superiority. They knew that the best solutions often came from cooperation between different perspectives rather than the dominance of a single viewpoint. The vote that followed was closer than anyone had expected. Several species opposed accepting humans as equals rather than junior partners to be slowly educated over centuries. But others argued that the coalition needed exactly the kind of fresh thinking that humans could provide. The galaxy was vast and full of mysteries that their advanced civilizations had been unable to solve. In the end, the coalition voted to accept humanity not as subjects to be guided, but as partners in exploring the unknown regions of space. They would join exploration fleets as the species willing to ask uncomfortable questions and try impossible solutions. They would serve as bridges between species that had grown too specialized to understand each other. Jake returned to New Eden, changed by his experience, but still fundamentally the same farm boy who had left just weeks before. His family welcomed him home with a celebration that brought together neighbors from across the valley. Captain Brooks received new orders to begin recruiting humans for the Coalition exploration fleet. Amy Johnson asked Jake what it had been like to represent all of humanity in the galaxy's greatest trial. Jake thought about the question seriously before giving a characteristically human answer. He said it had not been about representing humanity's best qualities, but about showing that humanity's ordinary qualities were extraordinary in their own way. The story concluded with Jake back in his family's fields, watching ships launch from the new coalition base being built in their star system. Somewhere out there, humans were already working alongside aliens to explore regions of space that had remained mysterious for millions of years. They were approaching each new discovery with the same curiosity and determination that had made a colonial farm boy the key to passing the galaxy's ultimate test. Dr. Grant published papers about the trial that would influence human philosophy for generations. He argued that Jake's success proved that advancement was not just about developing superior abilities, but about maintaining the willingness to see beyond established patterns. The greatest civilizations were not those that had achieved perfection, but those that never stopped growing and changing. As Jake watched the stars from his family's porch, he knew that humanity's real adventure was just beginning. They had earned their place among the galaxy's great civilizations, not by proving they were better than anyone else, but by showing they had something valuable to contribute. The boy who had spent his life fixing broken irrigation systems had helped fix something much larger and more important. The galaxy had been running perfectly for centuries, but it had also become predictable and static. What it needed was not more perfection, but more possibility. Humans would bring chaos and creativity to a universe that had forgotten how to dream. They would ask why things had to be the way they were and imagine how they could be different. Jake smiled as he watched a human ship disappear into hyperspace carrying explorers toward the unknown edge of the galaxy. They would make mistakes and face failures that more advanced species would have avoided, but they would also discover wonders that others had missed and find solutions that no one else had imagined. That was what humans did best and what the galaxy needed most.